Picture this. You're in a cramped London room with 4 strangers. The walls are damp, the air feels alive with stench, and tonight's bath, a cold sponge rub, is only for important areas. In this sleep story, we'll walk through a day in 1850s London. From corsets soaked in sweat to food so spoiled it had to be masked with beer, you'll relive the incredible challenges of staying clean in the dirtiest of times. Ready to escape to the past. One laundry soaked in urine at a time. Imagine opening your eyes to a dark yellowish haze filtering through a cracked window. The air feels thick, stale, heavy with an uncomfortable mix of human breath, coal smoke, and something sour you'd rather not identify. A drip of moisture slides from the wall to the floor, joining the puddles that have seeped up from beneath the rotting boards overnight. It's a small room, though room might be a generous word. It's more like a box, crammed with 5 other bodies, each twisting and turning in restless sleep. One lies curled up under a threadbare blanket. Another sprawls awkwardly in the corner, snoring softly. Your mattress, if it can even be called that, is nothing more than a sack stuffed with straw, scratchy and slightly damp to the touch. Every inhale brings a fresh wave of odors. Sweat, both old and new, the faint bite of mildew, and the sour tang of unwashed skin. For most of the city's poor, this scene isn't out of the ordinary. It's Tuesday, or maybe Thursday. Who's counting? The days blur together when survival takes priority. Space is limited in a London tenement. Entire families pack themselves into single rooms, sharing every inch of the cramped claustrophobic square. The walls separating one household from another are paper-thin or non-existent, allowing you to hear every cough, snore, and whispered conversation from your neighbors. Last night, the man in the next room argued with someone, probably his wife, until she stormed off, slamming a door that barely held onto its hinges. Now it's morning, and the only sound is the occasional crackle of coal fires being relit somewhere nearby. That, and more coughing. You can't tune it out. The coughs aren't polite ones. They're deep, guttural hacks that echo through these halls almost constantly. Whether it's the coal smoke filling the air or some lingering illness, you can't be sure. What you do know is that it's not uncommon to wake up and find out a neighbor, or even a roommate, didn't make it through the night. A reality like that leaves little room for fear. Instead, it's a numb acceptance. Life and death are so tightly intertwined here that one often feels like a mere extension of the other. But not all reminders of mortality come in the form of sound. The walls around you, for example, tell their own story. The damp creeping through the cracks isn't harmless water. It's a breeding ground for mold, the kind that turns your stomach if you pay too much attention to it. Touching the walls leaves a faint, sticky residue on your fingers, a mix of condensation and years of accumulated grime, and those soft, wet plops you hear every now and then. That's just sections of the plaster giving up and falling to the floor. It's been happening for weeks. The smells can't be overstated. Coal smoke is one thing. Nearly everyone contributes to that particular cloud. But the real offender is the Thames. Even houses and rooms blocks away from its edge. The stench of sewage mixes with the smell of food waste and rotting things dumped into the water, all faintly sour, faintly metallic. And it's not all background noise. Some mornings the breeze shifts just enough to push that foul cocktail straight into your nostrils, making breakfast, if you can afford one, a little harder to stomach. For all its discomforts, this is home for an unsettling majority of Victorians. Reports from the period revealed just how dire urban living spaces were for lower-class families. The closeness of human habitation, it was noted, contributed not just to plummeting physical health, but also to the mental strain of living without privacy or a moment's peace. It was common for single rooms to house 6, 8, sometimes even 10 individuals, all trying to exist in the same suffocating space. There's a word for that kind of atmosphere. Intolerable. But what choice did they have? The lack of personal space meant everything was shared. Food, clothing, illnesses, and even though survival demanded cooperation, it also drove some people into silent exhaustion. You can spend only so many nights pretending not to notice the stranger on the other side of the room, weeping softly into a blanket before the numbness catches up with you. The mental toll of such conditions wore many down, and doctors at the time, though woefully limited in their understanding, were already making some connections between overcrowding and the rise in what they vaguely called nervous ailments. It wasn't the coal dust alone. It was living every single day beneath the weight of constant, unrelenting strain. You sit up, blinking against the dim light filtering weakly through the grimy window pane. Every inch of your body feels sticky. The sweat from your skin mixes uncomfortably with the grime that seems to materialize out of thin air. Or maybe it's just everywhere. There's no way to tell how long it's been since these walls felt truly clean. It doesn't matter now. Clean is a luxury. The truth is, this environment infects every aspect of your day before it even begins. Breathing felt like an effort the moment your eyes opened. Each inhale an unconscious gamble with whatever airborne toxins snake through the lungs. In these conditions, infections thrived. Diseases spread with a kind of cruel efficiency, leaving no family untouched for long. To make it through an entire childhood here was either proof of remarkable genetic luck or a cruel joke. It's no surprise that city officials, long before the Victorian age, had already begun tracking fatalities in worn, leather-bound books. And back then, death certificates arrived handwritten, ink smudged as if from hurried fingers. Nearly half of them listed the same culprits: tuberculosis, bronchitis, cholera, typhoid, illnesses merrily skipping from one packed room to another. So here you are, awake, and while the majority of your neighbors still lie wrapped in their lightless dreams, you know that the toughest part of the day has already begun, just trying to shake off the weight of a restless night. In modern terms, you might imagine some version of a morning stretch or splash of water could do the trick. That's not an option here. Your body feels heavy as you swing your legs off the makeshift bed, feet sinking slightly into the uneven floorboards. Around the room, the others begin stirring too. Someone groans. Another mutters something about having overslept, though whether they're late for work or merely worried about lining up for bread and milk isn't clear. There's no alarm clock here. Most rely on the sun, or, if they're unlucky enough to live near a noisier street, the thud of a horse-drawn cart rattling by. And so you begin. No bathroom to retreat to, no running water to splash across your face. Hygiene in these conditions is less about comfort and more about survival. You'll make do with what you have, and what you have, well, we'll get there. Morning means one thing here. It's time to wash. But don't picture warm showers, soothing steam, and that fresh scrubbed feeling. What you're about to face is a splash of cold water, sharp, shocking, and unavoidable. There's no soap, there's no long soak, and there's definitely no privacy. Most homes, whether cramped tenements or middle-class dwellings, didn't have running water at all. That meant everything: washing, cooking, even drinking. came from shared communal pumps on the street, assuming you lived near one. Fetching water was its own chore, particularly burdensome in tightly packed urban neighborhoods, where demand far outstripped supply. You had to lug buckets home, ration every drop, and find some way to heat it if you were lucky enough to have access to coal. For the majority, though, the water remained icy just as it was pulled from the pump, and that's what you'd splash across your barely conscious body this morning. Victorians approached bathing cautiously, almost suspiciously. Many believed too much washing could do more harm than good. It wasn't about dirtiness in itself. The concern was your health. Excessive bathing, they thought, could sap your strength or damage your vitality. This wasn't just a quirky superstition. It shaped entire routines. Instead of full baths, most people settled for sponge baths. The method was simple. Dampen a cloth or sponge, scrub your face and hands, and, if you were feeling thorough, give the armpits and groin a once-over. Feet, if they got any attention, were addressed grudgingly after everything else. In many ways, the process wasn't about becoming fully clean. It was about warding off the worst odours. For the poorest families in London's East End, even this minimal effort could feel overwhelming. Accessing water required sheer effort and time, balancing hefty buckets or barrels for blocks. Heating water wasn't just inconvenient, it was a luxury, one that poorer households simply didn't have. Soap, meanwhile, was as good as unattainable for the working class, since purchasing it involved dipping into coin meant for bread or candles. When someone did manage a sponge bath, the tools themselves were modest. A small square of fabric, rough to the touch, a bit of lint meant to pass for a towel. These were your companions. Forget scented oils or lotions. Cold water and elbow grease were the full extent of personal care. Even for families with greater means, bathing had its limits. True, the wealthier could afford copper bathtubs, sometimes positioned in well-lit kitchens so servants might carry heated water back and forth. These baths were the closest thing to what we'd call indulgent, but they came at a cost, namely the endless back and forth drudgery required for preparation. A family with diligent staff might enjoy a full bath once every week or two. In most cases, it was a pecking order affair, father first, mother second, and so on down the line, until children, often the ubiquitous last in everything, inherited water now murky with everyone else's efforts. By then, referring to the tub's contents as water became quite generous. This system of shared bathing wasn't unique to the working class. It extended throughout society, driven not by oversight, but by cramped realities. Without plumbing to rely upon, water remained as much an inconvenience as a necessity. Outside of baths, hand mirrors and basins became essential tools, stationed in bedrooms or communal hall corners. A quick rinse and you were done. Adequate, by their standards, but almost unthinkable today. Of course, many who lived closer to desperation skipped the ritual altogether out of necessity. Clothing absorbed sweat, oil, and grime over long stretches as laundry itself posed its own set of monumental challenges. Better to conserve water where possible. And on balance, the unspoken filth of everyday life faded into background noise. After all, if everyone smelled faintly of old sweat, coal fumes, and stagnant Thames water, was it even noticeable anymore? Modern germ theory wasn't yet mainstream at this time. No one understood microorganisms as cleanly as we do now. Disease appeared to emerge from foul-smelling air, miasmas, rather than invisible pathogens. Proper hygiene, in this mindset, wasn't directly tied to health outcomes. When illness befell a household, people turned their attention to purging unpleasant odors, reasoning, incorrectly, that freshening the air might cleanse the body. The divide between classes was sharpest here in hygiene. Many wealthier families installed outdoor plumbing systems, rudimentary flushing mechanisms placed near their properties at sizable expense. For servants or guests arriving fresh from the streets, accommodations improved significantly, but none of this hinted at a wider societal transformation. The majority of Londoners washed under harrowing conditions. Outdoor pumps, often worn down from overuse, served as bastions for bacteria, recycling contaminants back into circulation. Rivers and reservoirs smelled unpleasant year-round, no matter who handled filtration policies. Imagine the awkward bathside compromises bred by such necessities. A pot of water too cool to cut through grease lies at your feet. There's no lather, only raw, unguided scrubbing motion. Children attempting independence make modest progress. Parents cut corners to stay quick, rushed by schedules as much as desperation not to squander heat. Those involved didn't often look at parts they washed. This intimacy bordered shamefulness among crowded tenants, scant on privacy. Some people, out based on luck or geography, found facilities differently. Public baths sometimes existed within neighborhoods, hosting manual labor workers or professionals like tailors. Public baths offered cushioned alternatives under circumstances easier maintained than standalone methods back home. Despite mild abstention discouraging widespread overindulgence amongst Victorian wealthiers, it wasn't entirely barren. Those adhering philosophies defensively guarded alongside familiarity, functional efficiencies, grime-smoothed wrinkles, mimic unsurpassed warm beds, austerity offered sensation, contrary simplicity ordinary. Affording thanks prototypes embraced ideals toilet progressed. What if I told you that your morning brushing routine involved chewing celery until your mouth felt, well, slightly less foul? Victorians didn't have Colgate on their shelves or toothbrushes ready at hand. Instead, they made do with whatever they could afford, or whatever happened to be lying around. Using celery as a substitute for a toothbrush wasn't some health trend or clever hack. It was a desperate attempt to scrape away the residue of last night's meal, which was often heavy on sugar and starch. Sure, it wasn't exactly effective, but it was better than nothing. Toothbrushes, if you could call them that, were luxuries. Their wooden handles and bristles made of stiff animal hair made them both uncomfortable and expensive. Just buying one could cost about as much as feeding a family for several days. And let's be honest, when you're struggling to keep food on the table, buying a toothbrush doesn't exactly make it to the top of the list. For those without access to such extravagance, the next best option involves scraping teeth with whatever you had. A bit of cloth, a twig, or your fingernails if you were really in a bind. Hygiene at this point wasn't about sparkle and shine. It was about stopping things from getting worse. Now, about toothpaste, or should I say, the tooth cleaning concoctions people whipped up at home. Forget the minty, foamy stuff we're used to now. Victorians reached for some creative and slightly alarming alternatives. Soot, for instance, was a common ingredient. Yes, straight up, black, ashy soot, left over from burning coal. It got everywhere, stuck to everything, and for some reason, they thought it might be helpful for teeth. If soot wasn't to your liking, there were other abrasive options, like chalk dust or powdered cuttlefish bone. Imagine standing at your basin, mixing up a paste that could also double as a recipe for sanding wood. It wasn't pleasant, but it got the job done. Sort of. Cuttlefish bone, in particular, is a fascinating detail. Originally meant as a treat for birds to sharpen their beaks, humans turned to it to polish their teeth. The logic was sound. It was mildly abrasive and plentiful, but instead of leaving you with pearly whites, it usually left gums red and shredded. Today, this would send most of us running straight to the dentist. But then again, a Victorian dentist wasn't the savior you're imagining. Speaking of dentists, imagine dealing with an aching molar in London, 1850. There's no sterile office with a reclining chair and a soothing playlist. Your dentist, or more likely your local barber or blacksmith, doesn't have specialized training. What they do have is a set of crude tools that look more suited to repairing a horse carriage than doing anything inside the human mouth. Think pliers, hammers, and the occasional chisel. Anesthetic? Forget it. If you were lucky, someone might offer a stiff drink beforehand or shove a rag between your teeth to bite down on. And you'd need it, because pulling a tooth wasn't just painful, it was traumatic. Without antibiotics or antiseptics, infections were common. People didn't walk out of that experience feeling better. Most staggered out with their mouths bloodied and swollen, praying the extraction wouldn't lead to something worse. The real tragedy was how preventable a lot of these dental disasters might have been. But here's the thing. While Victorians recognized the pain of a bad tooth, they didn't fully understand its connection to overall health. Think about it. If you had no concept of germs or bacteria, why would you suspect that a rotting tooth could eventually lead to an infection spreading through your bloodstream? To them, a toothache was just bad luck, or perhaps punishment for a sweet tooth. It wasn't until much later, when germ theory started gaining traction, that people realized the intimate relationship between oral and systemic health. What made it worse was the diet of the time. Sugar, surprisingly affordable by the mid-19th century, became a major part of daily life. It was baked into bread, stewed into jams, and loaded into teas. Combined with a lack of refrigeration, which made processed and preserved foods more common, you had a perfect storm for dental decay. Salted meats and sugared fruits sat alongside bread and porridge that stuck to teeth like glue. Without effective tools to clean their mouths thoroughly, people unknowingly set themselves up for disaster. Decay wasn't just a possibility, it was inevitable. And when teeth went bad in Victorian England, they went really bad. Left untreated, even something as small as a cavity could spread into an abscess. A pocket of infection that caused excruciating pain. If the infection continued to spread, it could lead to swelling, facial deformities, and even death in the most severe cases. For some, it wasn't just about the physical pain. Poor dental health carried a social stigma too. Rotten or missing teeth hinted at poverty, negligence, or both. And in a society obsessed with appearances, that hurt more than just your smile. But for all their suffering, Victorians were resourceful. They came up with clever ways to mask the worst of their dental struggles, partly for health reasons and partly for appearances. Chewing celery, for instance, wasn't just about cleaning teeth. Its fibrous texture helped remove some of the surface buildup that would otherwise lead to visible staining. It didn't solve the underlying issue, but let's be honest, if you were missing half your molars already, you weren't chasing perfection. You just wanted to get by. And then there was the occasional use of tooth powders sold in markets and shops. These powders promised miraculous results using ingredients like ground oyster shells, which acted as abrasive cleaners, and occasionally included soothing additives like clove oil. Of course, whether these powders delivered on their promises was debatable. One thing was clear though, they often did more harm than good in the long run, wearing down tooth enamel and leaving gums inflamed. Despite the creativity, the lack of real dental care left many people permanently disfigured or in constant pain. Tooth loss became inevitable for most by middle age. And speaking of middle age, if you made it that far, congratulations. The Victorian era wasn't exactly known for its longevity, and poor dental hygiene played no small part in declining health overall. Infections, pain, and malnutrition caused by a lack of properly functioning teeth added up over time. So here you are, holding onto a stick of celery because, really, what else is there? No fluoride, no floss, no bright minty paste to save the day. You're chewing, and if you're lucky, the stringy fibers are doing a decent job of picking debris out of your teeth. But the ache in your back molar reminds you this is only temporary. That molar won't last. A visit to the barber, a terrifying, inevitable prospect, looms somewhere in your future. As you spit out the remains of your morning cleaning ritual, you have to wonder, what's worse? The brushing, or knowing that nothing you're doing now will really stop what's coming next? It's all just a matter of time. You're simply delaying that trip to the man with the pliers. And yet, somehow you carry on. Everyone does. It's just another fact of life in Victorian England. Grit your teeth, hope for the best, and try not to think too hard about what's lurking in your mouth. But don't worry, the next challenge is already waiting. After all, your teeth might be a temporary disaster, but what about your hair? That's another story entirely. Time to grab some eggs or vinegar. Or maybe just move on with the day. Imagine waking up and not having to think about washing your hair. Not today, not tomorrow, maybe not even this month. That's not laziness, it's just life in Victorian England. Washing your hair was an ordeal, one that required effort, time, and the kind of patience most people couldn't afford. With no commercial shampoos and no hot running water, the entire process was something you'd put off for as long as possible. When the time finally came, the experience might involve cracking a couple eggs over your head, or, for a less slimy option, pouring on a splash of vinegar from the pantry. Women especially faced a unique challenge when it came to hair care. Washing your hair meant upsetting hours, sometimes days, of carefully maintained styling. Elaborate hairstyles were more than a fashion statement. They were a commitment, twisted and set to last for weeks, sometimes longer. The upkeep alone required effort. Oil and pomade were smoothed into the strands to keep the hair in place, but these didn't contain preservatives like modern products. Over time, they'd spoil, leaving behind that unmistakable smell of rancid fat. But again, this wasn't seen as a reason to wash everything out and start fresh. Why go through all that trouble when it was easier to mask any unpleasant smells instead of tackling the source? Hats and powders were common solutions, a quick cover-up that made things a bit more bearable. When it came time to wash, the ingredients for Victorian shampoo were a bit unconventional, to say the least. For those with access to a well-stocked kitchen, eggs were a popular choice. The yolk helped remove buildup, apparently leaving hair softer afterward, though you'd have to rinse carefully to avoid smelling like breakfast all day. If eggs weren't your preference, you might try something acidic, like vinegar or even rum. Black tea occasionally made the list, especially for brunettes who wanted to enhance their hair's shine. And while these remedies weren't harmful by design, they were hardly ideal. Vinegar, for example, stung if it dripped into your eyes and left a lingering scent sharp enough to remind everyone what you'd been up to. Of course, the wealthy had more resources at their disposal. They might afford mixtures that included essential oils like rosemary or lavender. pleasant enough to counteract some of the natural odors all that pomade had been cultivating. Servants were tasked with heating water, a rare treat, and helping to wash or comb out hair. But even for those with a bit more luxury, hair washing still wasn't frequent. That's what made wigs so appealing, especially among the ultra-rich. They offered a quick solution. Trim and style once, slap it on, and you were good to go. Except wigs presented their own problems. They were heavy, itchy, and prone to attracting lice or other unwelcome visitors. If you weren't keen on looking like you had something crawling on your head, close encounters with boiling water regularly became part of wig care to kill off pests. For the working class, things were far less glamorous. Heated water wasn't an option for a quick rinse, and many didn't have the time or means to maintain elaborate hairstyles. Hair washing, therefore, was simplified even further, down to not doing it. That didn't mean these women ignored their appearance. Curls stayed in place thanks to methods like wrapping hair around rags at night, and beer was occasionally used to add volume and shine. Sugar water served as a sort of early hairspray, stiffening strands into place for special occasions. But whatever you put in your hair wasn't coming out for a while, not unless it rained or you somehow got scolded for being wasteful with water. And rain wasn't entirely inconvenient. In fact, if you were brave enough, a good downpour could double as an opportunity to rinse that accumulated mess. It wasn't elegant, and it definitely wasn't comfortable, but it got the job done, for the most part. Detangling hair, on the rare occasions it came down for washing, was no simple task. Wooden combs were common, but they were hardly the smooth, machine-polished tools we know today. Instead, they snagged and tugged, painfully pulling apart every knot and clump of grease that had built up over the weeks. Wealthier households might have access to bone or ivory combs, which worked better, but even these weren't truly foolproof. And the longer the hair, the longer the process. Women considered their hair their crowning glory, and many grew it long, often past their waists, so you can imagine how much work it took to manage strands that hadn't seen water in a month. This emphasis on appearance set certain standards, especially for women. Elaborate hairstyles weren't optional for those who could afford them. They were expected. This meant spending less time thinking about comfort and cleanliness and more time focused on achieving just the right look. Accessories like ribbons, flowers, or feathers sprinkled across hairdos weren't uncommon, particularly for formal events. Of course, all this decoration made rinsing everything out even more excruciating when the time came. And yet, despite the effort, hairstyles didn't always hold up against the realities of daily life. Coal smoke clung to everything. If you were outdoors for too long, ash and soot could settle right into your hair. Bad weather ruined intricate curls. Add in the rancid oils and pomades, and a woman's head could carry an entire kaleidoscope of smells. Some sweet, some sour, most somewhere in between. It was less about being clean and more about meeting the bare minimum necessary for social acceptance. After all, everyone knew someone who smelled a bit off. Unless it was absolutely unbearable, you didn't complain. And imagine the insects. Cleanliness wasn't as straightforward in a world where lice were a regular part of life. While treatments involving vinegar or other sharp-smelling substances helped deter them, they were hardly foolproof. It's why women took so much care in wrapping their hair at night, both to preserve their curls and to keep unwanted visitors from making themselves at home. Men's grooming didn't fare much better. Pomade wasn't exclusively for women, and many men relied on animal fat-based products to slick back and style their hair. These too went rancid, leading to frequent substitutions like wax or clay mixtures that helped hold things in place without such a sharp decline in smell. While men weren't as concerned with elaborate styles, beards added another layer of maintenance, or lack thereof. Street accounts from the time described the musty, oily smells that could cling to a man's facial hair, particularly if he worked near open flames or in the city's notoriously smoggy air. So why put so much effort into hair care at all, given the challenges? The same reason many Victorians did anything: to fit in, to meet expectations, and for some, to hold on to a sense of dignity in the face of constant discomfort. Hair was one of the few areas where creativity thrived despite the filth. Even the poorest made the effort, braiding their daughter's hair or curling it with a hot poker warmed over an open fire. These rituals were a quiet statement, proof that people could still find ways to care about themselves, even when the odds were stacked against them. By the time you ran a comb through your hair, slicked it back with whatever you had, or pinned it into place, you'd already spent far too much energy on the task. If you were lucky, it would hold for the day, or maybe a week if you avoided too much weather or work that required bending over. But the next challenge always loomed. Your hair might be done, but consider this: the layers you're about to wear are unwashed, sweat-stained, and not likely to change anytime soon. You might be wearing them for weeks. Maybe it's best not to think too hard about that just yet. What if you had to step into the same corset, sticky with sweat, for weeks on end? Even the thought feels suffocating, doesn't it? But for most Victorians, this wasn't just reality, it was routine. You see, dressing in the 19th century wasn't a casual exercise. It was a full-body commitment, starting with layers of dense, restrictive fabrics designed more for fashion than comfort. Every outfit began with the undergarments: linen chemises or shirts, stockings, and for women, drawers or petticoats that added those famous Victorian silhouettes. On top of that came the corsets, forcing torsos into unnatural curves while pressing snugly against the skin. For anyone wearing these outfits, the sweat of daily life soaked its way into each layer, one by one, creating an overwhelming cocktail of smells and dampness that was just there all the time. Now, imagine those inevitable odors sitting trapped beneath layers of unwashed fabric. Because here's the thing: clothing might have looked elegant on the outside, but hygiene barely played a role in designing what people wore. Washing clothes regularly wasn't practical or even possible for most people. Laundry was backbreaking, labor-intensive work that demanded hauling gallons of water, boiling it, scrubbing by hand, and rinsing several rounds until the fabric was clean enough to dry. It wasn't just a chore. It was an ordeal, one that took up valuable time and resources. This meant that clothes, especially the heavy, complicated outfits associated with Victorian life, weren't washed after every wear. In fact, some were rarely washed at all. The layers closest to the skin, like undergarments, might get a rinse more often, but anything beyond that could go weeks, even months, without seeing water. For the wealthy, there was at least some kind of a system. Their wardrobes typically included more linen undergarments, which absorbed much of the sweat and odors, acting as a barrier between the body and the outer layers. These underthings could be swapped out and washed more frequently, sparing the outer garments from immediate filth. Although, to be clear, more frequently doesn't mean daily. Changing underclothes once or twice a week was considered thorough by Victorian standards. The poor didn't always have options like this, Many couldn't afford undergarments at all, which meant sweat, dirt, and body odor seeped directly into their shirts and dresses. These outer layers, being harder to replace and more difficult to clean, bore the brunt of daily wear and tear, creating a deeply unpleasant cycle of grime and sweat. Corsets, in particular, were filthy traps of their own. Tightly laced to support and shape the body, they pressed against the skin with hardly any airflow. Throughout the day, the material, often made of whalebone, cotton, or even steel, absorbed oils, sweat, and dust from the streets. Once fitted in place, corsets didn't exactly lend themselves to easy removal. Loosening or relacing one took time and energy, so most women simply kept wearing them until they couldn't anymore. What did they do to combat the smell as the weeks piled on? Well, they'd tuck sprigs of lavender or fresh herbs into their undergarments if they could afford them. It was a small, fragrant barrier between the reality of the garment and the polite demands of society, but no amount of lavender could hide everything. And let's not forget what those long skirts went through. Women's fashion prioritized fabric-heavy designs, layered petticoats, crinolines, and draping skirts that reached the floor. They might have been beautiful to look at, but they were also highly functional, at collecting filth. A single walk through London streets could leave the hem soaked in sewage, streaked with mud, or coated in coal dust. Dragging these skirts behind you meant taking the worst of the city home with you. Many fabrics held onto those smells and stains like unforgiving reminders of the world outside. And when it came time to clean them, well, brace yourself. The process didn't just involve boiling the garment as one might expect. No, it often meant soaking it in something truly unexpected. Human urine. Yes, urine. Before detergent and bleach were household staples, ammonia, found in urine, served as a popular cleaning agent. It was harsh enough to break down oils and stains, making it one of the most effective solutions for whitening fabrics, especially linens. Poorer households would even save chamber pot waste specifically for laundry day. For those who could afford it, pre-collected urine was sold commercially and purchased by the bucket. Either way, the process was as unpleasant as it sounds. Soaking clothes in urine added even more offense to an already grim task. But it worked, and when the alternative was wearing visibly stained clothing, people were willing to suffer through the smell. Now, laundry wasn't just labor-intensive because of the washing itself. A full load of garments needed rinsing, again and again, before being hung out to dry, weather willing. Sheets or long skirts could take days to properly air out, leaving a constant backlog of chores. That's why washing day, for most Victorian households, happened no more than once a week. For many working-class families, once a week was wishful thinking. It wasn't uncommon for clothes to go unwashed for closer to a month, especially in larger households where water had to be fetched and heated entirely by hand. The water itself wasn't always what we'd call clean either. Hauling it from shared pumps or public wells meant relying on sources often contaminated with silt, waste, or worse. Imagine scrubbing your corset with water that already carried the stench of the Thames, only to hang it out to dry while more smoke, ash, and odor wafted through the air. It's no wonder people struggled to feel clean. There was no escaping the grime. Men's clothing wasn't spared either. Dark suits, which became a fashion hallmark for Victorian gentlemen, were a practical response to their environment. Dark wool helped conceal stains from coal dust, horse manure splashes, and other unmentionables kicked up from city streets. But just like women's clothing, these suits weren't washed often. Instead, they were brushed, and aired out as much as possible, with stronger smells masked by colognes, if someone could afford it. For those who couldn't, well, the odours were just part of life. The smell of sweat, souring wool, and smoky air all blended into the background of polite society. Everyone smelled bad, so pointing it out would have been pointless. Even with growing awareness of germs and sanitation in the late Victorian period, these clothing practices hardly changed overnight. Cities like London began promoting public hygiene with greater fervour, but on an individual level, the realities of laundry and personal upkeep remained daunting. Soap remained expensive, water remained scarce, and time remained valuable. Only those at the very top of society could afford to escape these struggles, and even they couldn't avoid them entirely. No amount of wealth could stop the sheer difficulty of keeping a sprawling skirt free of filth, or a wool coat from absorbing sweat. The smells, the effort, the grime that hung over every layer of clothing, it all served as a reminder of how much daily life revolved around survival. Every corset cut the waist, every petticoat dragged filth, and every shirt soaked in sweat reflected the constant tension between looking presentable and simply making it through the day. It didn't matter whether you lived in a palace or a slum. Clothing was its own battlefield. The next time you throw your clothes into a washing machine, it might be worth remembering just how much simpler life has become. Back then, even wearing clean clothes was a challenge, and dressing each morning meant confronting fabrics heavy, not just with sweat, but with the weight of daily survival. Speaking of daily survival, there's one major hygiene hurdle we haven't talked about yet, because underneath all those layers, there's still a very human need that has to be managed. No plumbing, no toilets, just the reality of having to deal with your bodily functions in a city bursting at the seams. Let's step outside for that. Quite literally, stepping outside in 1850s, London wasn't exactly refreshing. Before you even moved a muscle, the air hit you. Not clean, crisp air, but a suffocating wall of smells. Sewage, rotting garbage, the sour tang of human waste, and of course, horse manure. Anywhere you turned, some new stench crept in. It clung to your clothes, your hair, and your spirit, making you wonder if you'd ever feel clean again. And this wasn't something you could escape. Every street, every alley, every corner bore the same overwhelming odor. A reminder of the city's unchecked growth and its utter lack of sanitation. The streets themselves were another form of chaos entirely. Most waste, whether human, animal, or otherwise, ended up dumped directly into the road. Chamber pots emptied out of windows splattered the cobbled streets below, their contents joining piles of scraps, rotting food, and animal entrails discarded without a second thought. The sheer volume of waste would have been bad enough, but then rain added another layer. When storms hit, all that refuse turned into thick, filthy rivers, swirling through alleys and flooding under doorways. And on those rare dry days, the refuse hardened into dust that coated surfaces and drifted about, ensuring that even if you managed to keep your shoes clean, you were still breathing the city's filth with every inhale. And let's talk about those thousands of horses clopping up and down London streets. They weren't just transportation, they were walking waste machines. Each horse left behind about 35 pounds of manure per day. With so many clogging the roads, the build-up became impossible to manage. It didn't matter whether you were rich or poor, walking downtown or in a quieter neighborhood. The smell of manure was so widespread, it practically defined the city. People trudged through it. Carriages kicked it up into the air, and occasionally a horse would die in the street. adding one more problem to an already overburdened system. Dead horses could take days to remove, their decaying bodies offering new layers of stench and disease, while passers-by simply stepped around them. But as bad as the streets were, they couldn't compete with the state of the Thames. London's great river had transformed into a literal open sewer, a heaving, toxic flow of human waste, industrial runoff, and debris from hundreds of tanneries, slaughterhouses and factories. Everything flowed into the river. Its waters shimmered faintly with the oil, chemicals, and decay that floated upon the surface, while its banks bubbled with the gases released by all the matter festering below. Entire neighborhoods near the river were suffused with a smell so vile it moved many to nausea. Even those who lived farther away weren't spared. The odor carried on breezes, slipping into every crack and corner of the city. And in 1858, it reached its horrifying peak. The Great Stink. That summer, the heat soared, and with it, the stench of the Thames became unbearable. The city had grown used to bad smells. There were plenty to go around. But this was something completely different. The smell didn't just linger in the background. It seemed to press against people, suffocating anyone who dared to go outside. The Houses of Parliament, positioned precariously on the river's edge, became uninhabitable. Legislators reportedly soaked curtains in lime chloride and draped them around the chambers in desperation. But it didn't work. The stench forced even the most stubborn officials out of session more than once, leaving the nation's politics at a standstill until something could be done. But the Great Stink wasn't just inconvenient. It was deadly. Entire neighborhoods had been suffering from recurring outbreaks of diseases like cholera. And while no one understood exactly how they spread yet, the connection between the toxic environment and the soaring death rates was harder to ignore. For years, people blamed miasmas, the so-called bad air thought to poison those who breathed it. This led to attempts at covering the problem with perfumes or fumigating spaces. But of course, that did nothing to stop actual contamination. Cholera outbreaks ravaged the population, leading to thousands of deaths. Other illnesses, like typhoid, cropped up as well, spreading through contaminated drinking water and filthy conditions. The situation was so dire, it became impossible for even the most distant politicians to deny. Enter Joseph Bazalgette, a man with a plan, and just as importantly, government backing. Bazalgette was tasked with a monumental challenge, designing a sewer system that could transform London's filth-ridden streets into something resembling a functional modern city. It was a level of engineering unlike anything the city had seen before, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Lives were on the line, anger was boiling over, and the once great River Thames teetered on the edge of complete ecological collapse. Bazalgette began work on an ambitious project. Over 1,000 miles of new sewers would be laid under London, intercepting waste before it could reach the earth or the river's surface. Smaller neighborhood sewers would funnel waste into larger intercepting lines, which would then carry the sewage downstream, far from the city center. With brick tunnels carefully planned to optimize flow and durability, every inch of this system reflected careful thought. Bazalgette knew that the city's population wasn't going to shrink anytime soon, so he deliberately overbuilt the system, predicting future growth. It was a rare instance of someone thinking ahead at a time when most infrastructure projects barely met current demands. The construction process was grueling. Digging through London's dense streets required heavy excavation, displacing thousands of residents and demolishing buildings to make way for progress. The work was slow, messy, and dangerous, particularly when workers uncovered cesspools that hadn't been drained in decades. But slowly, a cleaner future took shape. By the time the project wrapped up, London had one of the most advanced sewage systems in the world. Waste no longer poured directly into the Thames, but was carried far enough downstream to seem out of sight and out of mind. The impact was immediate. The overwhelming stench that had plagued London began to fade. Cholera outbreaks, which had devastated communities year after year, finally began to subside. People could walk along the riverbanks without retching from the fumes. The psychological effect was just as profound. The successful completion of such a massive undertaking brought a sense of hope. Proof that even a problem as overwhelming as the Great Stink could be tackled with steadfast determination. It was a rare victory for public health and a sign that life in the city could improve. Still, the solution wasn't perfect. Raw sewage no longer flowed into central London's riverbanks. But it wasn't exactly being treated either. Instead, it was dumped further downstream, shifting the problem to less visible areas. Wealthier sections of the city, naturally, benefited first, while the poor, once again, waited to see the results. Even so, what started with Basilgate's sewer system laid the groundwork for future advancements in sanitation and public health. Looking back, the Great Stink stands out as a turning point, a moment when public pressure forced governments to take action and recognize how deeply infrastructure and health are tied. It was messy, slow, and by no means glamorous, but without it, London's streets would have remained an open sewer, a hazard to everyone walking its cobbled paths. And while the Thames no longer bubbles with untreated waste today, the history lingers. For the Victorians, this crisis was a reminder that the problems of unchecked growth always come back to haunt you, and sometimes that haunting sneaks up one smell at a time. By the time Basilgate's work was complete, Londoners could glimpse what a cleaner city might look like. Diseases didn't vanish overnight, but the plummeting cholera rates showed that change was possible. They didn't know about bacteria yet. They didn't know about viruses, but they knew one thing for certain. The air was lighter, the streets were cleaner, and the river didn't make your stomach churn quite so much. And yet, the problems of filth hadn't truly disappeared. They were still there, on plates, in cups. Because if you thought the stink outside was bad, just wait until you hear what the Victorians were risking every time they sat down for a meal. Imagine sitting down to a meal of bread that's just starting to sprout mold, paired with a pint of beer that feels safer than water. Not exactly appealing, is it? But for the Victorians, this wasn't some strange survival challenge. It was Tuesday. Refrigeration didn't exist. Food preservation was crude at best. And water, well, you drank water at your own risk. If you were smart, or rather, if you wanted to survive, you learned to work with what you had, or what you could stomach. Take meat, for instance. Without refrigeration, fresh wasn't really an option, so preservation became the name of the game. But the preservation methods weren't exactly gentle. A chunk of beef might be salted until it resembled a block of wood more than dinner. The salt drew out moisture, yes, but it also turned the meat so tough you could chip a tooth on it if you weren't careful. Smoking was another popular choice, but that meant eating something that tasted like ash and carried who knows what kind of long-term health risks. And then there was pickling, dunking vegetables or even fish in vinegar until they practically dissolved into that sharp, tangy bite. The result? Food that lasted significantly longer but didn't always taste like, well, food. For the Victorians, eating wasn't about enjoying flavors. It was about surviving another day without starving. preservation altered everything: taste, texture, and most importantly, nutritional value. Fresh fruits and vegetables were rarely on the menu for the working class, since they spoiled too quickly and couldn't always be grown in cramped industrial cities. By the time food made it to the table, most of it was stripped of any real nutrients, made worse by overcooking everything to kill off bacteria or mask early signs of rot. That soup you're stirring, it probably started with meat so questionable even the dog wouldn't look at it. But cooking covered a lot of sins, or at least buried them deep enough that you could pretend you didn't notice. The problem wasn't just limited to how food was preserved, it was that everything sat on the edge of spoilage before it even reached your plate. Bread was left out for days, slowly growing green fuzz along the edges. Instead of tossing it out, you'd cut away the moldy parts and keep slicing. Why waste it when hunger didn't exactly allow for pickiness? Milk was another problem. Without proper cooling, it would curdle almost before it reached the table. The solution? Turn it into cheese, or better yet, sell it to someone too desperate to care. Even spices served a darker purpose. They weren't primarily for flavor, they were for hiding the putrid stench of food that had gone bad. Meat teetering toward complete decay. Cover it with heavy doses of cinnamon, pepper, or cloves. If it still smelled a little off, you probably just needed a stronger spice. Of course, all this seasoning did nothing to change the fact that what you were eating was, well, rotting. But at least it tasted like something else. There was also the water, or lack of it. Drinking plain water in Victorian London was a gamble most weren't willing to take. Rivers were more of a dumping ground than a water source. Cholera outbreaks spread mercilessly through contaminated wells, and even those far from the urban slums weren't entirely safe. Knowing this, people turned to alcohol, not for indulgence, but for survival. Beer, in particular, was a staple of daily life, even for children. Its low alcohol content, produced through fermentation, made it much safer to drink than water. The Victorians called it small beer, hardly stronger than modern non-alcoholic drinks, but it still came with enough potency to sterilize germs. You could see a child on their way to school clutching a cup, while adults sipping ale alongside breakfast. Wasn't an unusual sight either. It was a balancing act. Stay hydrated without killing yourself in the process. Street food didn't offer much relief. Vendors sold questionable meat pies that, if you were lucky, came from a cow, or something resembling one. The poorest turned to these carts for an affordable meal, knowing full well the meat inside might have been scraped off a butcher's floor. You didn't ask questions because it wasn't as though you had other options. Even milk sold on the streets came thin and watered down, often ladled from filthy containers swarming with flies. If adulteration wasn't bad enough, contamination was guaranteed. Health inspectors weren't around yet, and vendors weren't shy about cutting corners. Bread could be mixed with powdered chalk or alum to make it look whiter, while beer vendors diluted pints with whatever liquid was handy. It wasn't about scamming people to make enormous profits. It was about survival, plain and simple. But that didn't mean consumers got the better end of the deal. And then there were the illnesses. The connection between dirty food and disease wasn't well understood yet, so stomach cramps and sudden sickness were shrugged off as everyday misfortune. Maybe it was bad air. Maybe it was just unlucky. The idea that unwashed hands or spoiled meat could kill you, that was a revolutionary concept still decades away. Even the wealthy weren't safe from these kitchen-based horrors. Sure, their dining rooms were decked out with silverware and servant-prepared meals, but their ingredients were no less risky. Imported delicacies sat in ship holds for months without refrigeration. Tropical fruits, seafood, and game often arrived rotten or covered in flies by the time they reached the table. When they ate local foods, they faced similar issues. Meat was just as oversalted, smoked, or pickled to delay decomposition. Wealth simply allowed the means to disguise questionable fare behind extra layers of sauces or fancier spices. And yet, the upper classes had some peculiar eating habits that almost seemed designed to make things worse. They loved their strong flavors, cheese crawling with maggots, meats that had been aged to an almost offensive degree. These weren't accidents. They were considered delicacies. Victorian dining wasn't just about surviving disease. Sometimes it felt more like seeing how close you could get to it without tipping over. Food fraud extended beyond the wealthy and the poor's shaky markets. It was baked into the very fabric of Victorian industry. Shops sold food products with little regard for safety, sometimes with disastrous results. Milk could be stretched with dirty water. Butter wasn't always butter. And sweets meant for children often contained poisonous dyes to enhance their color. It wasn't just a lack of knowledge. It was a lack of regulation. Until sweeping reforms like the Food Adulteration Act of 1860, you could feed an entire family tainted food simply because there were no rules saying you couldn't. Some vendors boiled bones into gel and sold it as meat extract, while others treated weak tea leaves with iron fillings to give them weight. The profit margins were small, but the risks were life-changing. Meanwhile, poor hygiene among workers contributed to the problem. Factory hands and market vendors handled food after shifts spent amid coal dust, chemicals, or animal waste. Washing your hands before handling food wasn't just uncommon. It wasn't even a thought. Add that to the already poor state of the food itself, and every street market became a breeding ground for outbreaks of disease. Eating wasn't simply sustaining yourself. It was testing your body's ability to survive a hostile meal. Against all doubts and odds, people plowed ahead with meals that would send any modern health inspector into shock. Spoiled food might wreck your stomach, water might kill you, and falsified ingredients might poison you. But what choice was there? For the lower classes, skipping meals wasn't an option. Eating what you could afford meant living on the edge of medicinal necessity. People relied on a stomach strong enough to battle and reject whatever errors came their way. You might look at a Victorian menu, roast meats, fresh pies, their reserved top hats still on high tables, and imagine elaborate, inviting puzzles history romanticizes. Hidden truth, nearly destroyed through edible coping century solutions, collapses layered improvised instincts beneath sheer deprivation, adaptive grand meals themselves. Coley, medium contrast, consumption effort stitched, beauty ramshackle. What if every time you powdered your face or dabbed your cheeks with rouge, you were slowly poisoning yourself? For Victorian women, this wasn't some gruesome thought experiment. It was reality. Beauty standards didn't simply dictate how you should look. They dictated what risks you were expected to take to get there. The pursuit of a perfect complexion, a pale, smooth canvas, free of freckles or imperfections, led to the widespread use of cosmetics laced with some of the most toxic substances imaginable. The price of beauty, for many, turned out to be far greater than they expected. Start with the face powders. The ideal complexion was ghostly pale, a sign of both health and privilege. Tan skin carried implications of outdoor labor under the sun, marking someone as lower class. But if your natural skin tone didn't comply, you could always fake it, using white lead-based powders. These powders effectively gave the user that coveted paleness, while also quietly destroying their skin beneath the surface. Lead doesn't just sit there quietly on the skin. Over time, it builds up in the body, causing severe health issues. The constant exposure could lead to hair loss, muscle paralysis, and even, in the worst cases, organ failure or death. Yet the powders flew off the shelves, because as far as society was concerned, a pale face was worth the risk. Even women who might have suspected something was wrong kept applying layer after layer. The damage began slowly, inflammation, flaking, an odd greyish tone appearing after months of use. Then came the sores, the scarring. Some women became so desperate to reverse the damage, they tried even stronger concoctions, which only made things worse. And the irony of it all, the very thing they were trying to hide, blemishes, discoloration, became unavoidable after years of covering them up. They had to use more powder to disguise the damage, locking themselves in a vicious cycle they couldn't escape. But lead wasn't the only dangerous ingredient tucked inside cosmetic jars. Rouge, used to achieve that natural flush of health on cheeks, commonly contained mercury salts. In small doses, mercury can irritate skin and cause rashes. In large doses, it wreaks havoc on the nervous system. Many women who applied rouge daily ended up battling tremors, memory loss, and irritability, symptoms eerily similar to those seen in industrial workers who had prolonged contact with mercury. Doctors of the time might have noticed the connection, but the obsession with beauty kept these products on vanity tables, no matter the risk. Lip and eye cosmetics weren't much better. Lipstick often included, you guessed it, more lead, while eyeliners sometimes relied on kohl that contained antimony, a substance that worked as a sort of primitive mascara, while carrying its own risks of irritation and poisoning. The idea of applying makeup to enhance your natural beauty was popular, especially after the Industrial Revolution, when commercially produced products became more widespread. But as with much of Victorian life, the price of innovation often came at the expense of safety. For women outside the homes of London's wealthy, homemade remedies took centre stage. The results were no less questionable. If you couldn't afford fancy powders and rouges, you might reach for lemon juice to fade freckles or lighten your skin. Lemon juice, acidic and harsh, had its own set of consequences. Prolonged use could dry out your skin so severely that cracks and sores would form, leaving the surface exposed to infections. Then there were the somewhat more bizarre attempts to achieve a glowing complexion, like raw meat face masks. Some women would lie in bed with slices of raw beef pressed to their faces, hoping the moisture and nutrients from the meat would restore their skin overnight. It might sound horrifying now, but at the time, these treatments were seen as resourceful and even indulgent. If facial upkeep weren't enough, women were also expected to maintain their hands and lips, a soft, delicate appearance that spoke of not lifting anything heavier than a needle. Butter often served as a moisturizer for chapped skin. Yes, butter, rubbed in liberally and left to soak in. It wasn't glamorous or scientific, but it was accessible, and that was often the main consideration. Alternatively, some would apply crushed strawberries to their lips as a natural tint, though the effect didn't last long, and the stickiness attracted every particle of dust in the surrounding air. The obsession didn't stop at skin. Victorian fashion fetishized small waists, and corsets did the heavy lifting, but they also created their own problems. The tight lacing many women endured left deep, painful indentations in their skin. To combat this, some turned to substances like zinc oxide creams, which were meant to soothe sore skin but often contained impurities that introduced even more irritation. Others simply ignored the sores, hiding them beneath layers of fabric and hoping they wouldn't worsen. None of this would have been necessary without the intense societal pressure women faced to maintain impossible beauty standards. Women weren't just judged on their ability to look attractive. They were judged on how hard they worked to maintain the illusion that it came naturally. The characteristic of Victorian beauty was understated elegance, appearing effortlessly flawless, even if it took hours behind closed doors and an arsenal of toxic products to achieve. A blemish-free face suggested good breeding and virtue, while wrinkles or spots whispered of poor hygiene or lack of discipline. Never mind genetics or environmental conditions. The responsibility for meeting these expectations fell solely on the individual. Even the idea of aging gracefully was treated as a failure of sorts. Women sought ways to soften crow's feet, and grey hairs were plucked meticulously or hidden beneath hairpieces. In more extreme cases, some turned to carbolic acid, essentially an early form of chemical peel, to strip away wrinkles. Unsurprisingly, this was both extremely painful and dangerous, leaving many with permanent burns or disfigurement. And yet, these traditional beauty practices stood in stark contrast to the realities of hygiene we've already explored. Imagine slathering lead powders onto your face when you barely had access to clean water to wash it off at the end of the day. Imagine sleeping in raw meat masks in a room reeking of damp sweat and coal smoke. The physical toll of daily life didn't match the pristine porcelain image society demanded. Women played makeup artist, chemist, and contortionist all at once, just trying to keep up. And each step carried risks nobody could predict, or few wanted to acknowledge. Despite their struggles, women persisted. They created rituals out of necessity, whether to fit within societal molds or to regain some sense of personal control over their bodies. Even in environments filled with filth and disease, beauty remained a priority, for better or worse. It's hard to say whether this persistence reflected admirable strength or simply another layer of Victorian hardship. But it does reveal something about how deeply these ideals were woven into the fabric of daily life. You begin to see their world differently, through the cracks in their skin, through the pale ghost of lead that dusted every cheek. It wasn't just vanity, it was survival, social survival. But in chasing one form of perfection, they often ran headlong into permanent harm. They traded their health, their comfort, even their lives in some cases, for fleeting approval in a rigid, unforgiving society. And yet, they endured. Surviving day to day in the Victorian era meant constant trade-offs. You endured bad air to work, spoiled food to survive, and dangerous beauty rituals to hold your place in a world that left little room for flaws. It's a sobering thought. Behind the powdered faces and carefully laced corsets were real people trying to navigate a harsh, polluted world without losing themselves. And while few might have admitted it, deep down, they knew they were paying a steep price. What came next wasn't a rejection of these standards, but a slow reckoning with their cost. As more women began to question the toll beauty took on their health, as scientific advancements hinted at the dangers lurking in their cosmetics, cracks began to appear in the societal push for perfection. But those shifts were just the beginning of what would become a long and ongoing conversation about beauty, health, and safety. For now, though, women powdered their faces, tightened their corsets, and kept moving forward, step by precarious step. Of course, Even a flawless face couldn't mask the other struggles of daily Victorian life. Clean water remained scarce. Disease crept in through even the smallest cracks in sanitation. Still, people persevered through it all. They didn't just survive. They laid the groundwork for cleaner, safer, and frankly, less poisonous futures. Let's not forget, behind all the grime and lead powder was a generation that refused to give in, no matter the cost. What finally convinced the Victorians that cleanliness could save lives? Well, it wasn't some sweeping epiphany. It took decades of filth, disease, and death for society to gradually accept that maybe, just maybe, soap and water were more than luxuries. They were necessities. Germ theory didn't arrive overnight, and even when it did, not everyone lined up to embrace it. Through most of the 19th century, people still clung to the idea of bad air. The miasma theory claimed foul smells cause sickness. So instead of cleaning things up properly, folks tried masking the odors with perfumes or opening windows to waft the stink away. It wasn't until scientists like Louis Pasteur began challenging this notion, connecting diseases to microscopic organisms and poor hygiene, that people began to understand the link between dirt and death. But change didn't come easily. Habits formed over centuries don't just vanish because someone says they're bad for you. Convincing an entire society to rethink how they lived, how they bathed, ate, managed waste, was a monumental task. Resistance came from everywhere. Some people didn't believe in germs at all. Others found the concept threatening to long-standing traditions. And then there was the simple fact that staying clean was expensive and time-consuming. Without plumbing, bathing, or washing anything was such a chore that many avoided it entirely. Even for those who were willing to try, access to soap, clean water, or even basic education about hygiene wasn't always guaranteed. So the question became, how do you change an entire culture's approach to cleanliness? Victorian reformers tackled it in multiple ways. Public health campaigns appeared, trying to get the word out, often with posters plastered in neighborhoods or distributed at schools. These weren't subtle, by the way. Imagine posters with bold claims like, "Wash your hands or risk the grave." Simple, maybe even patronizing by today's standards, but effective nonetheless. Hand washing became a common topic, especially for food preparation and medical care. People slowly started hearing about the importance of keeping not just their homes clean, but their own bodies as well. Advertising also played a surprisingly large role. Soap companies leaned into hygiene education, not because they were altruistic, but because they saw profit in it. Ads for soap didn't just promise clean skin. They promised healthier families, social success, and even attractiveness. Using soap became a sign of not just cleanliness, but refinement. It was less about survival and more about being modern. This shift in attitudes made soap not only popular but indispensable. Manufacturing improved, making soap cheaper and more widely available. Specialized products popped up. One soap for laundry, another mild bar for your face. Families that had once scraped by without soap suddenly found it affordable to scrub floors and hands. But for many, baths remained out of reach, especially for those crammed into crowded tenements where water was scarce, fuel was expensive, and privacy was non-existent. Public baths became part of the solution. By the mid-19th century, cities started building bathhouses where people could go for a proper soak. For a few pennies, a worker could get access to water and occasionally soap. It wasn't glamorous. Most public baths didn't change the water as often as they should have, and bacteria thrived in those lukewarm tubs. but it was better than nothing. For many, this was their only chance at a thorough cleaning. Bathhouses became popular gathering spaces too, turning hygiene into a somewhat communal experience. Of course, bathing once a week or so wasn't going to remake society overnight, but it was a step in the right direction. Reformers also pushed hard for educational strategies, particularly in schools. Children, they realized, were more open to new habits than their parents, and if you could teach kids the importance of washing hands, cleaning teeth, and keeping tidy, they would carry that knowledge home. In poorer communities, where adult literacy was low and health education was virtually non-existent, kids became the surprising bearers of hygiene advice. Schools started dedicating time to lessons on cleanliness, even including practical demonstrations. That ripple effect, spreading knowledge from the classroom to the family, helped transform attitudes over time. The improvements extended beyond individual efforts. Public sanitation became a cornerstone of the Victorian hygiene revolution. The Great Stink of 1858 had already forced London to confront its appalling waste management, resulting in Bazalgette's sewer system, which set the gold standard for urban development at the time. Inspired by this success, other cities began following suit, creating sewer networks that removed waste instead of letting it fester in streets or rivers. Streets were cleaned, gutters were expanded, and trash collection became more organized. Cleaner public spaces meant fewer chances for disease to spread, and it didn't take long for people to notice the difference. Cholera outbreaks started waning, and life expectancy began to creep upward, not dramatically, but noticeably. Hospitals, too, became agents of change. Before the hygiene revolution, medical care was as likely to make you sick as it was to heal you. Untreated wounds, dirty instruments, and unwashed hands turned hospitals into breeding grounds for infections. But with science on its side, medicine began advancing rapidly. Doctors started recommending things like sterilizing equipment, thoroughly washing one's hands before surgeries, and keeping wounds clean. Today, these sound like no-brainers, but they were revolutionary then. It marked a paradigm shift. Instead of simply reacting to illness, medical professionals began embracing prevention. And prevention started with cleanliness. The broader changes weren't just about comfort or convenience. They were about human dignity. For much of the Victorian era, those who lived in poverty were seen as inherently dirty, their filth blamed on moral failings rather than systemic inequality. This perception allowed society to justify ignoring or mistreating large swaths of the population. But the hygiene revolution reframed cleanliness as something everyone deserved access to, flipping the narrative from blame to improvement. It wasn't just for the wealthy anymore. Clean water, soap, and sanitation became public health priorities because they didn't just benefit individuals. They kept entire communities safer. Soap alone didn't solve London's hygiene crisis, nor did sewer systems or bathhouses or school lessons. The transformation was slow, uneven, and messy, quite literally. Progress came from decades of effort across many fronts: better policies, new technologies, and a shift in public mindset. For every major stride forward, there were setbacks. There were countless families who couldn't afford soap, who lacked access to fresh water, whose lives remained as grimy and difficult as ever. Real change wasn't just about offering cleaner streets or cheaper soap. It meant addressing the deep social inequalities that had plagued Victorian life from the start. By the late 19th century, though, the results spoke for themselves. Streets were less disgusting. Water was less deadly. Bathrooms, slowly appearing in wealthier homes, became less crude. The air no longer reeked of rotting waste quite as much as it had. People began to let themselves imagine what a cleaner, healthier future might look like. It wasn't dramatic. There were no sweeping, Hollywood-style moments where someone fixed everything all at once. But after years of neglect, the city itself started to feel lighter. The fight wasn't over, but society had learned its lesson. Filth had a price, and so did ignoring it. Germ theory changed how Victorians lived, but maybe more significantly, it changed why they lived the way they did. Once people accepted that small acts of cleanliness, washing hands, bathing, scrubbing floors, could save lives, those habits didn't feel optional anymore. They became universal. Even the smallest efforts began to seem worthwhile. It wasn't fashionable to be clean. It was essential. So the next time you step out of a warm shower or lather up with soap that doesn't cost a week's wages, consider this. None of it happened by accident. Someone fought for cleaner streets, cheaper soap, safe water, and public baths. Someone endured cramped schools and suffocating public health campaigns so their children might have a better chance at survival. And through all the resistance, frustration, and filth, progress marched on. What might have felt like small victories then laid the foundation for the cleaner, healthier world you live in now. And tomorrow, when you brush your teeth or scrub your hands, maybe you'll remember the long road it took to make those actions second nature. Even in a world of soot-filled air, unwashed corsets, and streets clogged with manure, people fought for something better. The Victorian shift from chaos to cleanliness wasn't just a story of soap or sewers. It was a testament to how even the dirtiest challenges can spark progress. And today, we live surrounded by the results of their resilience. Clean water, modern medicine, safe food, all things they never had but ultimately made possible. As you lie in your fresh sheets tonight, maybe take a moment to appreciate those little conveniences, because history reminds us, none of them were ever guaranteed.